So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at loops in Python, as well as the types of loops that Python offers. However, nothing is worse than having to do the same thing over and over again. Meanwhile, programmers don't particularly like repeating themselves either, unless they are also trying to fall asleep. Thankfully, most programming languages have what is called a for loop, which repeats a specific block of code a number of times automatically. So for example, let's say you want to print hello 5 times. Then you could be doing the following by using the print function 5 times. But this is rather tedious. Instead, we could use a for loop to reduce the amount of typing and repetition. So we can say for x in range, then parentheses 0, 5. So we can use the colon to terminate our for loop. Then press enter. As you can see, we get an indentation. So in this block, we write the code that will be repeated inside the loop. So I'm gonna write print hello, and when I run the code, then we get to see that hello has been printed out on the console 5 times for us. So we use the for to start our loop in Python, and the x here is a temporary variable used to store the integer value of the current position our loop is iterating. So we can use any other variable name of our choice in place of the value x. And one thing to note is that the variable x is limited to the scope within the for loop, meaning we cannot access the value of x outside our for loop. However, the range function here is used to create a list of numbers ranging from a starting number up to an ending number. So our range function in this for loop is actually telling Python to start counting from 0 and stop before reaching 5. And for each number we count, Python should store the value in the variable x. So inside my print statement here, I can also print hello with the value of x using formatted string. Then I'm going to add my curly bracket and then pass in the variable x. And when I run the code, then we get hello with each value of x printed out on the console, which is pretty awesome, right? So as you can see, using the for loop has actually saved us from writing too much lines of code, because good programmers hate doing things more than once. So the for loop is one of the most popular statements you often see in programming languages. Meanwhile, you actually don't need to stick to using the range function when making for loops, because we can loop over different kinds of data types in Python, like strings, lists, tuples, and so on. So for example, I'm gonna create a variable called name and set its value to the string Adam. And on my for loop, instead of the range function, I'm simply gonna add name and then finally print the value of x. And when I execute the program, then we see that Python iterates over our string Adam and print out each of the iterative value for us on the console. However, instead of using a string, let's try out using a Python list for our for loop. So I can select my text here and add the square bracket. Then I'm going to add another name. Let's say Schweib, comma, and then Khalid. I'm also going to change the variable name here to names. So on my for loop, I'm going to say for x in names variable and then run the code. Then we see each individual names printed out for us. And as I mentioned earlier, this code is a way of saying to Python that For each item inside our list of names, store the value in the variable x and then print the content of that variable on the console. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier that we can loop over different kinds of data type in Python, now let's actually use the for loop with a tuple instead of a Python list. So I can change my square bracket with parentheses. Now we have a tuple of names. Finally, in my print statement here, I'm gonna use the formatted strings. So when I add double quote and say hello, curly bracket, and then pass in the value of x, and when we run the code, then we get back hello with each of the value inside our tuple. So now let's talk about another kind of loop in Python, which is called the while loop. As we all know, a for loop is a loop for a specific length or number of iterations, but a while loop is a loop that is used when you don't know ahead of time when it needs to stop looping. So for example, I want you to imagine a staircase with 15 steps. The staircase is indoors and you know you can easily climb 15 steps to get up the stairs. However, this is an example of a for loop. But imagine a staircase going up a mountain. The mountain is really tall and you might run out of energy before you reach the top. Or maybe the weather might turn so bad, thereby forcing you to stop climbing. So this is actually what a while loop looks like in real life. Therefore, let's now create a while loop in Python. So I'm going to start by creating a variable called num and set its value to 5. Then we're going to use the while keyword in Python to create a while loop, then followed by the condition. I'm going to say while num is less than 10, column, then print my endless loop. And when I run the code, then my loop keeps printing out the value my endless loop on the console. And this message won't stop printing out on the console as our program keeps running. So to stop the program from running the loop, all you need to do is to press Ctrl plus Z. However, let me show you something even cooler. After my column here, I can update the value of num variable. So I can say num equals to num plus 1. And when I run the code, then we get back the message printed 5 times on the console. So our loop started counting at 5 for the variable num. And at this line, we increment the value of num by 1 every time the loop runs. And when the value of num has incremented to 10, thereby making our condition to become false, then the loop stops printing our message on the console. Now, let's talk about a key concept that you need to understand when working with loops, which is called nested loops. A nested loop is a loop statement inside another loop statement. In other words, the inner or outer loop can be of any type, such as a while loop or a for loop. And that is why nested loops are often called as loop inside loop. So to implement a nested loop in Python, I'm going to start by creating a variable called items and set its value to a Python list. So in Python, we can create a list whereby each element inside the list is also a list by itself. To illustrate, I will add another square bracket for my first list and pass in my first item in the list in the form of a string, which is red, comma, then pink. I'm also going to add a comma, then another square bracket for my second list. This time, I'm going to give it the item berry, comma, then grapes, and another comma for my next list. So square brackets, then cat, comma, and dog. So as you can see, we've now created a Python list, and this list is also containing a list of individual items. So to print the item inside our list, I'm gonna say for item in items, then column. So remember that the item here is my temporary variable for looping over the list. So I'm gonna say print item, and when I run the code, then we get back 3 lists stored inside our items variable. So to also access all the elements inside this list, I'm gonna erase my print statement here and then add another loop. So I'm gonna say for x in item. Again, I took a temporary variable x for each of the elements inside item, then column, and then print the value of x. And when I run the code, then we get back all the elements printed out on the console, which is pretty awesome, right? However, I want to pose this to you as a challenge. Can you try to figure out how to print out this multiplication table on the console for us? I will give you a few seconds to pause the video and give this a go, and come back for the solution. So did you have a go? Here is the solution. I'm going to create a for loop for I in range from 1 to 13, then column, and then another loop for x in range also from 1 to 13, then column. So now I'm going to say print using formatted strings, add a curly bracket, then I, multiply by another curly bracket, x, then equal to last curly bracket, I multiply by x. So out of the inner loop, I'm gonna print this piece of string. However, our first loop here is counting from 1, stopping at 13, and our second loop is also counting from 1 to 13. Then we printed the value of I and the value of x, and then multiplying both the value of I and x together. And when I run the code, then we get back a 12 times multiplication table printed out on the console for us. So we've now come to the end of this tutorial regarding loops in Python. First, you learned about using for loop, also while loop and nested loops in Python. Then you also had a challenge and saw how to use nested loops and generate a multiplication table on the console. So in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at how you can recycle your code using functions in Python. So what's now a function? That's the mystery we're going to be exploring in the next lecture. I can't wait to see you there. And as always, take care.